Hello, everyone. I'm John Coleman from Apocastis an Institute for the Humanities and Alternative College and High School here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. This broadcast, very helpfully being joined by David James Rodriguez, is the November 2025 edition of This Month in Education. Our topic this time around is character education crises and ways to solve it. And we have some articles from Zero Hedge, and I threw in one from Substack as time allows. There's always so much to get into, and we'll always have plenty of fodder. That's no doubt there. Now, you don't see our pretty visuals, our pretty mugs on the screen for the sake of tech smoothness, let's say, because of these cursed routers. You might have noticed from previous episodes, we tend to stall out and it leads to all sort of editing headaches and things. So we're biting the bullet. And anyway, we have our screen share queued up. Additionally, I will toggle from time to time to David's linked tree. And you can see all of his sites there, his consulting work with homeschoolers, and all sorts of good things David can elaborate upon. And before we get caught up with himself, just one announcement concerning Apocastis, and that is still not too late. Our cycles course, our historical cycles course, is leaving the station. We had our first session today, but it's not too late to join. It's entitled The Sons of Issachar, Historical Cycles and World Orders. And we're getting into that very topic. It's a historiographical course. It's appropriate for students of about 15 years of age on up. We got into today what is history, what is memory, and we got into the perennialist and Abrahamic conceptions of history, moving next week into St. Augustine's City of God. And this course runs at least for 10 classes. We might have another class or two on flamenco and alternative and revisionist cycles. But anyway, that's called The Sons of Issachar. And with that being seen too, I'm going to kick things over to David. And how you doing, David? And what's new on your end there?
Yes, great to be with you and talking about these important topics. So, yes, just working on a movie actually. So that's interesting. And yeah, working with more graduates and get them out of the school system and help them redefine what is education and what are they after. And yeah, just more and more parents wanting to get some support and some help how to approach this. AI is such an incredible thing. I don't know if your audience has played around with it, but a very fascinating thing. And I can't remember if we mentioned it in previous shows, but there was a ex Google executive who said that he does not recommend people get into the medical and the legal fields because just in a few years, AI is going to catch up entirely and these people won't have a career. So don't put that time in there. But yeah, working on some different projects and just keeping the path blazing with voluntary education solutions. It seems to be the future that's exciting for me.
That's great. Thank you, David. And as the audience knows from various broadcasts that we put out through the Institute, if there's a slight delay between responses, it's simply because we're toggling on and off with the audio. If that's the worst headache we have in life, we're not doing too shabby. And it's interesting. It's you mentioned medical or legal fields, certainly accounting. They're all going the way of the dodo. And it's for me, David, and we can certainly look at the AI topic in this episode or in the future, but I'd like to briefly pick your mind. It's almost the best of times and the worst of times educationally, meaning from where I'm coming from. On the one hand, the field of education is going to formal education is going to have to change. It's going to very suddenly have to confront things that's been kicking down the path for over 100 years, and it's it must implode. Something has to give within the next 10 or 20 years. It cannot just keep pretending this is the 19th, 20s, or 30s. So that's good news. The bad news, and I'd like your thoughts on this, the bad news is the population, appropriate to our articles here. The population is so utilitarian. I don't think they're going to necessarily miss formal education. And I don't mean the all the things that we critique and have driven us out of the mainstream field, but the whole concept of a systematic study or the discipline of it, or I think the things that the excellence, I think that has driven us into alternative education, the search for excellence. I'm a little bit worried, or a lot bit worried, that the general society doesn't have those appreciation for learning because it's so utilitarian. It's been trained to be so utilitarian. Do you have any initial thoughts on those points? I'm going to mute here.
Yeah, I think as we spoke in previous shows, and it's important to emphasize, is that the moral education is so lacking that, sincere people like you and me, and maybe your audience members too, as a child, we're looking for the truth. I'm looking to know what's right, what's wrong, and how should I live my life. The stoic um, virtue, or the stoic desire, like how do you live a good life? These, I think, are because they've been overlooked. And I have a business degree. It took me 5 years and $50,000, and it really didn't really affect me positively. I mean, it's an experience, right? You can find a positive experience out of all things if you're optimistic, but the world that we live in does not address the fundamentals of education, in my view. And I think that's what AI is going to force these institutions to do, is to address these basic philosophical questions that many of the greats have addressed already. And over 100 years ago, they have removed these types of higher questions and higher insights because it challenges the state. And, I'm a fan of Lysander Spooner and Murray Rothbard because these guys help me understand the world that I live in. And I never heard about any of these guys throughout all of my years of formal schooling. So that's what I find so suspect about the current educational institutions. And there's good ones out there. The Mises Institute is one that I like. But the majority of these universities, because they're either funded by the state or subsidized by the state or somehow affiliated with state federal dollars, they got to play the game. You got to do the dog and pony show to show the state what schooling and education you're giving your students. Just like many homeschool families, if they opt to get a stipend from the government, you have to show them your work, and they have to approve, even though you're at home, because that money does not come free of obligation. So these institutions, I think, are in deep trouble, and I'm happy about that.
Great, and it will be interesting to see how things develop. As develop, they must. Now, David, my thought was, if I may do with the stories to begin, because it's shorter, to begin with this one. Um, these are the world's most educated nations, etc. And then we could boogie woogie over to this hidden crises, which is a longer treatment. Do you have any objections to that?
No, that's perfect.
Okay, so I'm going to set this up, and then I kick it over to David to elaborate. But this is pretty straightforward. We have this from Zero Hedge. This is written by Tyler Durden, and you'll recognize this from Fight Club, or some of you won't. Some of you young people won't recognize Fight Club. You should. My goodness, 25 years ago that thing was made. But anyhow, 1999 was a good year for movies, but that's another discussion. Education levels. So we have 45 countries listed here. And David, how would you break this down? And what was your mind in choosing this interesting schema, as I'll scroll up and down throughout?
Yes, this is one of my favorite topics, which is how do you measure education? Because the parents out there and the intellectual people and regular people, like how do you know somebody has an education? And I was taught a high school diploma is essential if you want to have a job, not being homeless or not pushing the broom around. And then if you're really serious, you get a college degree. And so years later, I can reflect and realize and share with people that was not true. I got scammed. My parents and grandfather who helped, fund my education, they were doing what their generation was taught. And so this shows Canada having the most, quote, educated population by percentage. This is 64% of the population has a college degree. That's a lot. That's almost 7 out of 10 people have this extra degree. And then you go down, you see Ireland, South Korea, Luxembourg, UK, Australia, Sweden, and the US. And if we just focus there, for me, the last 5 years has been quite a revealing process, as they might say, an apocalypse to reveal. And if you remember in Canada, there was a big trucker rally where there was people driving to go exercise their freedoms, and the tyranny that I saw in Canada was that they were doing some type of technological surveillance and shutting people's PayPal off and their ways, even I think bank accounts as well. So the first point is that just having a college degree, in my view, does not mean that somebody or a society or a country is educated, because the root word of education, educo, is to pull from within. And the formal educational process is about memorizing and then regurgitating on tests in accordance with the dean of education, with the professors, and you have to fall in line with these types of curriculum. And I'm interested in liberation and empowerment and living a good life and these higher questions. And not just because I am my age now, even back then, in my teens and 20s, I was having these conversations, but there was very few people to have these kind of conversations with. So even you look at those other countries, 64, even with the U.S., and it goes down. So I wanted to open up a conversation, and if people in the comments have ideas too, I'm open to it. But how do you audience, and even John here, how do you define education, or how do you measure education? This is a better conversation, in my view, and the world just hasn't come across this type of measurement process. However, there are more, I would say, abstract ways of determining if one's educated or not. And that can be through performance, that can be how they treat people, how they speak with people, how they interact with the poor, the elderly, the weak, people who can't help them. I mean, these are higher levels of education that now I see the mountaintop. Now I see where I want to go and where I want to bring my friends and people who like these types of concepts and ideas. And it's just, they try to make it so simple, like it's math, like a education degree. If you have a degree, you're intelligent. Or in the dating world, is this person educated? Well, he has a degree, so he must be educated. Or like the PhDs, the MBAs. And this is not to defecate on anyone out there with degrees. As I said, I have one, and I have family members who got these degrees. But if they don't have the basics of what education is and understanding where these types of ideologies can lead, which is, I've learned this and I'm done. Now, the commencement ceremony, when you graduate and you throw your hat off of the stage, yay, I'm finished. No, commence means to begin. You are beginning when you're 22 or 23 or any age you get this university degree or even a high school diploma. You know, they can have commencement ceremonies there. And I like the idea of what it's related to a little bit to AI was if you and I in the audience are going to be anywhere in the industry and marketplace of leadership, we're going to have to keep learning. And every day I wake up, I'm grateful to be alive. So I get to keep learning and get to, buy books or borrow books from the library or watch documentaries, do these types of things that are exciting. And I think that's the one of the marks of an educated person. And I'll give it back to you to ask what you think some of the marks of an educated person are, because for me, one is being excited about learning, excited about reading, or trying a new experiment out. I got a new idea or have a new project to do it and not even be attached to the outcome per se, but to do the thing, to be in the action, to be in leadership. I think these are some of the better topics for a truly educated person versus they have a high school diploma, they have a degree. And, I'm sure there are, you have an organization too, and your certifications and diplomas and degrees are valuable. It's not a broad statement, but the majority, in my experience, has shown that many people with degrees, many people with these pieces of paper, they think that's the end of their learning journey, and it's actually the beginning.
Great. Thank you for that meditation there, David. And of course, before I answer your question, one of the things that struck me, or two of the things that struck me, is that this was compiled by Visual Capitalist, interesting organization. And the other thing that struck me, and you saw me, and the audience saw me looking this question up, what are the 5 I's? Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the UK, and the US. These are um, nations that operate with a lot of uh, subversion and spying, and they're at the top of the list here. And a lot of the populations within these countries are subject to propaganda. Most recently, most infamously in America, where since uh, the Obama administration, which had some interesting educational changes, as David knows, um, the Smith-Mundt Act was repealed, and so there's nothing stopping the state from dropping propaganda on the inhabitants. And I look at some of these other countries that are so quote unquote educated. Some of these countries, and this is my language, they're very cucked, to be frank. I mean, look at Canada. I mean, Canada. Look how do these countries, including these United States, how do these countries behave, or rather, how do their state structures behave during COVID-19, and how pliant were the populations? I mean, it's almost the more college degrees they have, the more cucked they were. And again, that's my crude
Yes,
language.
right.
But yeah, to answer David's query, and this is something I've been talking about and thinking about myself recently, because in alt ed, this is going to get blown sky high too, with different changes, and we better anchor ourselves into what is our telos, whether it's homeschool, unschool, all these road schools, and so forth, et cetera, et cetera. And revisiting, what is it that formal learning, if it's a homeschool pod, something more decentralized, fine. But what is it exactly that we are able to offer that cannot be offered by these machines and this utilitarianism? And to David's question, what is education? Uh, and I think the formal learning environment, however that might look, can offer this in a unique way. I would say that education means, as David pointed out, a wonder that continues, a wonder, a hunger for knowledge, a humility towards scholars and towards scholarship, and realizing that we can't always Google. Shame on John Coleman. We can't always Google every question, and uh, ultimately. that as you pointed out, a lot of people, so-called educated with these degrees, don't read. We could do a whole show on that sometimes. All the surveys of high school and college graduates that don't read. In fact, as time allows, we might get to this article, the dawn of the post-literate society. Well, where are these post-literate societies? Where is this post-literacy, this literacy, not illiteracy, literacy? We can read, but we do not. Well, very often it is in these super quote unquote educated societies that you see the most antipathy towards a lifelong, true educated demeanor. David.
Wow, that's a great point. The literacy and reading is probably the superpower of the human, as you know, and maybe your audience does too, because you get to explore new ideas, new perspectives. And as John Stuart Mill said, you can't really opine or have a full understanding of a subject until you've looked at the subject from all the angles possible. So pro, con, indifferent, agnostic. If you really want to have a understanding, you want to look at all the different ways you can look at it. And in my research, they want to get rid of words. This goes back to George Orwell and Newspeak, right? Which is to get rid of the words where they lose meaning. So freedom is slavery because they don't know what it means, or double speak or double think, where you can hold two ideas which are opposed to each other, but then say that you support both ideas because you don't understand what the ideas are. So, yeah, this is, I think, one of the key points. I'd love to look at that article or what you see and or recommend. I mean, just the title alone shows, I think, a little bit of what people want to be aware of, that there are predator psychopaths who clearly were running the pandemic of the last 5 years, and they don't care about the human family. They care about their family, I'm guessing, but they see other humans as inferior races, inferior people, and this is how they, I think, justify what they're doing. This goes back to the eugenics movement with Galton, and even Malthus. There would be a lack of food, so by killing these people, I think, who was the one who created the a lot of the abortion stuff, Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger, they can justify and say, look, these poor little humans, these poor little people, they're going to be in pain. So by us giving them a shorter lifespan, we're actually being compassionate with them. So this goes again, you can see the eugenicist type ideologies in the mask stuff of the 2020s and 2021, where people would come up, and this was in Santa Cruz, California, and they say, no, you should have a mask on. I say, I can't breathe with a mask on. And there was no compassion there. They're trying to virtual signal, oh, it's for the community. I say, I love the community. That's great. But I can't breathe with that thing on. And so they're trying to make you feel guilty for exercising the number one right of the individual, which is the right of freedom of association or self-ownership or freedom of expression. These are the basics, and they were doing it for your own good. And I just saw a quote recently. I can't remember if it was from the Nazis or the Bolsheviks or whatever totalitarian regime of the last 100 years, but the phrase was, it translated to, for your safety. So anytime the government tells me something's for my safety, I have suspicions. And it was just an unbelievable experience to go through that. And I don't know what your experience was, but it was, I was in the urban area and I'm now in a rural environment. They didn't really have too much of a a hiccup over here because the sheriff and the DA publicly said they're not going to enforce the mask order. So they're like, lockdown, shutdowns, what are you talking about? And we're like, yeah, man, like they shut down everything. You couldn't go get a coffee. You couldn't go to church. You couldn't get a burrito. Like it was mega totalitarian 1.0. And the next, 2.0, 3.0 is not going to be good. But this, as you pointed out, coming from a very, quote, educated population. Canada has laid down, and I did a little bit of research on the first, I think, 6 countries there on that education list, and many of them don't even have gun rights. I think Luxembourg and maybe Japan, but it was for hunting, it was for other reasons, not self-defense. So again, back to pursuing the truth of, am I allowed to defend myself? Well, please, King, sire, do I have permission to defend my life and my liberty or property that was granted to me by the creator or nature? Will you please give me a permission slip? And it's becoming clear, if someone's interested in freedom, in righteousness, goodness now, or they're interested in safety. And this is not a new program. This is an old program that I had to rediscover for myself, and that's why I'm sharing it with the audience, because you see the patterns. And God bless these other humans out there who, they say, I'm wearing the mask for you, or I got the vaccine for you. It's like, no, you're not responsible for me. And I'm not sure if I told you this story, but we were giving out free hugs in Santa Cruz. We did 40 weeks of free hugs right there on the right by the lighthouse, by the ocean, because we realized that people are in a trance and only agape love can. What you guys are doing out here. And I was very kind, because I realized yelling and being angry with entranced people is not going to be helpful. I said, ma'am, can I ask you a question? She says, yeah. It says, are you really afraid of a virus? And her and her husband both masked up and shaking yes. She says, yes, we're very afraid. I said, maybe you should stay home. Because we're out in public, where this is a voluntary free hugs, public area. It doesn't make sense that if you're afraid of a virus, a deadly virus, you're going to be out here walking around, putting your life in the hands, per se, of a mask. So this is the doublethink. This is the newspeak, and it's directly related to reading books, to expanding your vocabulary. And you might know about the studies where they've done research about prisoners, and people in prison have a very limited vocabulary. And so, because words indicate meaning, if you have a small vocabulary, you have a smaller view of the world. And I can relate, when I learn a new word, I'm like, wow, it's kind of like the story of Helen Keller, the blind deaf lady who became a huge inspiration, but the first 10, 11 years of her life, she was just a wild child because no one knew how to deal with her. Well, her teacher, Anne Sullivan, bless her heart, spent, I think it was 3 to 6 months teaching her sign language in her hand. Imagine that, teaching sign language to a blind girl, but she did it in her hand. And Helen Keller later wrote about the moment when she first discovered words, because everything before words was this kind of like caveman or Neanderthal type existence: food, all these bodily functions, sleep, food, these kind of things. And she said when she learned the word water, she said when Anne was signing the word water, she was running this cool liquid substance on my hand, and I finally understood that this liquid substance meant water. She said a whole new world opened up to me, and she said I could see, even though she's blind, and using sign language, I could see. So words are so important, and we can talk about this here or other shows because it's so fascinating. But language itself, how it shapes consciousness, and if you notice on your smartphones, many of the functions are a picture, and in your, I think Windows 11 and even like Google Mail, these uh, tech companies, they use pictures. They don't use words. They use pictures. And yes, this is a way to maybe move quickly and not have to express it, but there is an agenda to get rid of words, and I'd be curious to hear what the post illiterate or the post literate society article is about, because I think that's what they want, and they'll probably get some portion of the population, and they have probably, I don't know, a portion of it now that don't read or don't like reading, and I'd be curious to hear what that article depicts, because I think that's what they want to do, and one way around it is to give away and help people learn about these amazing books. You know, if you're listening to the audience, put your favorite book, you know, in the chat. I want to know. Maybe there's a book. I'm sure there's lots of books that you guys know of that I don't, that I haven't read and I need to read. I mean, I just bought 5 or 6 books in the last, few weeks. I'm like, oh man, you get inspired with the topic and you want to start learning on the subject matter. But what is that article about, or what is the conclusion that you think might be interesting to discuss in that article?
Sure thing, David. Thank you for that rejoinder, and just a few points to follow up on. I'm reminded you mentioned the prison literacy and things. Of course, the great American example from Malcolm X's autobiography. He talks about learning how to read in jail, and even starting with the dictionary. And working his way, literally reading again and again the whole dictionary from cover to cover, and going from there and reading all the books in the prison library, and a real example of an autodidact there. And right now, and I suspect we're going to see this much more because of the COVID-19 disruptions, because of various things in American society. We're going to have a tidal wave of true illiteracy, not just illiteracy, being able to read but not beyond text messages, signs, menus, but not actually reading in any deep sense. That's illiteracy. But I do believe we're going to see a rise in true illiteracy. And there's a gentleman on TikTok, I believe, and he does not know how to read. And he's gone through so-called education, got his various degrees and whatever, but did it by BSing his way through the whole thing. And I believe there are many, many, many thousands and tens of thousands. You want to say something, David?
No, I was just going to say that's amazing. That's a very interesting thing.
And this man, you talk about how reading, and these articles say as much in their own ways, how reading changes one's perception. He's blown away because he's now at 30 or 40 years of age, realizing he wants to read, and he just can't just keep asking everyone for the rest of his life to fill out checks and whatever, this, that, and the other. He wants to learn how to read at his age, and it's very difficult emotionally for him to be at a first grade reader and sounding out words, but he's doing it. One of the things, reading changes. He is blown away, this man. He's blown away by this society, how reading changes it as he's learning. And the idea of, for instance, a little thing, I give you an example before I briefly summarize this article to David's question. But this gentleman, he's blown away by the signs in the supermarket. The fact that in the aisles, you don't have to, up until now, for 4 decades of his life, he's had to ask everyone where things are. He can't read the signs on the bottles, neither on the signs on the aisles. And he's blown away the fact that the aisle signs make it so easy, now that he can read, to get his bread or his pasta or whatever. It's remarkable. We take this for granted. You're going to see with this post-literate society, you know, things in a bad sense that, you know, people, their worldview is going to be tremendously constricted to the great pleasure of the archons of this land. Anyway, to summarize before I kick it to David, the dawn of the post-literate society, this article, as well as these two fellows from Tyler Durden from Zero Hedge, will be down below in the description. But the summary of this basically, and it is a hefty article, you'd want a hefty article on this topic, wouldn't you? You couldn't have a short one on the topic at hand. But they're talking, because obviously screen usage, there are many graphs about less and less people reading. I know people in my life in the 1990s and early 2000s who had very robust reading lives that no longer read. I'm sure we all know them. Maybe they are us. But one of the things finally that I found to be very much a takeaway here is that Mr. Marriott, the author, he says that as we move into a post-literate society, what we're going to start seeing more and more, and this is exactly what other scholars are pointing out, is the you can call it the gamification of life, the memification of life. You can call it supermodernity, postmodernity. But what he calls it is a magical reality, not in a good sense, meaning we're entering a society that we would associate thinking patterns of the ancient or the medieval world. That's what we're going back to, because just like in the ancient and the medieval world, we're coming to a point now where most people are not truly literate. Most people can still read signs, driver's license, text message with emojis. But most people are not actually reading. They're getting their information about life through images. And images make you susceptible to much more manipulation than text does, whatever the drawback. So my takeaway from this, and this, he says this several times in the article, that we're going to start seeing thinking patterns that we associate with previous major epochs of society, the ancient world or the medieval, because we're sinking back into this magical, dreamlike, and I don't say this in any positive sense, way of thinking. We're leaving the rational world, going back into the irrational world. And I'll give one example to this. And this is what we call memification. Because I believe a great deal of how the Second World War is presented in English-speaking societies is nonsense. People have no nuance whatsoever. Therefore, the Germans were the good guys. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that this is happening online because people are seeing a lie, the way the world wars have been presented, the cartoonification of the Germans. People are reacting to that. And you will now find people, and they will tell you, people will say the Nazis were good. And you will say, but look at your own political worldview is in contrast to that. And they will say it does not matter, because Hitler or the Nazi aesthetic is what matters. And this is magical thinking, meaning the historical reality, the rational reality of the Second World War does not matter whatsoever. What matters are memes and images completely removed from the actual context. And that was my takeaway. We're going to see much more irrational thinking. And I kick it over to David there.
Those are great points. I like the last point there because we are seeing I would say the truth about Israel's war on Palestine. And I made a video some years ago, which is you don't have to choose sides, which is you can look at the scenario and not choose Palestine or Israel. I mean, it seems that whoever's initiating war is the bad guy. But if you don't know, anybody who's initiating violence against a peaceful person is the bad guy, and there can be bad guys on both sides. So this is the left-right paradigm that I see it crumbling in some ways, and I see it strengthening in others. But to say that people that kill other people are good is a complete cartoonish reference, I think, as you said accurately. And yeah, the Hitler question is very interesting because he was a National Socialist, and it seems he was trying to get out of the bankster monopoly, and he even wrote about it in his books. So I can see how people are like, actually, he was the good guy. And it's like, he's not the good guy. Maybe he was doing what he thought was best for his country, but to call people that kill people good is not the righteous view in my point. However, some people can say we've been lied to about this story because of the history books and because of the agendas. And I think those are important rabbit holes to go down to, because the
And
one of
Steven
the other
Spielberg. Don't forget Steven Spielberg.
yeah, sure, using movies to skew the facts and to skew what really happened. It's a form of revisionism, and I can't remember who said this, but they said because people aren't reading books as often as maybe 100 years ago, for sure, 100 years ago, even 50 years ago, they're using visual media, movies, documentaries, and TV shows. I would say the uh, historical fictional narrative stories are some of the most deceptive. Let's say the Schindler's List. And again, I'm not saying that there's, good or bad people, doing all these things um, for the entertainment value, but for their own agendas. And it is hard for me to accept. I'm from a small town in Northern California, that there are hyper wealthy people who have plans for a global totalitarian state. 1900, I think, or 1901, by King Gillette, the business mogul who created Gillette razors. He wrote a book called World Corporation, and he talks about a world utopian, socialist utopia, and lays out what these steps are they're trying to do now. So it's basically understanding that just because we are from a small town, or we have a good heart and we have good intentions, it doesn't mean other people do. And this goes back to the importance of history. So I'm glad you guys are doing your history class, at Apocalypse Stacy's, to help people understand the importance of it. And again, Orwell was such a important figure because he did fictional books which turned into movies and affected the zeitgeist. But he said, whoever controls the past controls the future, meaning whatever stories that we tell in the past, that will determine the future. And then he said, whoever determines the present determines the past. So you can see how the news cycle correlates to the history books and then correlates to the future. So if anyone has ever read the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights Charter, it's actually a step back from the Declaration of Independence of these United States. And it says there's a lot there, but the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights says your rights are what the United Nations say your rights are, versus the 249, almost 250-year-old Declaration of these United States, that your unalienable rights come from, well, first of all, their life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, but they come from the Creator. And this goes, with in hand with John Locke and many other serious philosophers and intellectuals have emphasized the importance of noting that the rights come from your humanity or the Creator. And so this is some of that irrationality that you're speaking of, where people can be manipulated by what other people tell them. And in in a real educational institution like ours, we can ask why. But growing up, I remember being almost shamed for asking why, and this is one of the child's pressing questions, as it should be, because they're sincere scientists. They're trying to find the truth of the matter. And John Taylor Gatto had a very interesting insight, the New York 5-time teacher of the year. He says, when a student asks a teacher, why are we doing this? The reason the teacher gets upset is because the teacher doesn't know why they're doing this. They're just doing what they're told. They're administering the curriculum, not creating the curriculum, and they have their own agenda, which is, if my students do good on the tests, then I'm a good teacher. If my students have low scores, that's a reflection of me. So it's their own almost identity, almost self-esteem is related to how well their students do. And of course, they're moving the goalposts in all these places.
Also, David,
Yeah, go ahead.
their paychecks as well. Don't forget their bonuses and their paychecks.
Well, this is the real politic of it all, and my mother was a public school teacher, and I have family members who are retired also or currently working. So I think it's important for people to understand, when I'm talking about the school system, I am throwing the school system under the bus, but I'm not throwing the humans under the bus, because there's well-meaning, well-intending, loving people in these schools. But when your bread is dependent on you following through on these curricula, you do it. So this is what they've done. They basically have bribed adults and have persuaded them that morality, righteousness is less important than their roof and their bread. So this is one of the great challenges and opportunities that truly educated and pursuers of truth have now, and creators of culture, really, to depict these problems and to show the ways out, because I'm finally seeing it a lot on my feed, and people are calling out the school system in droves. But calling it out is one thing, and then removing your child from that system is a different ballgame. So that's where I think there's a real big need and demand, and that's what some reasons why I do what I do, because I understand the parents are terrified to pull their children out. Sometimes their spouse is not supportive, and maybe they got bad grades in school. And as Gatto said, grades don't measure anything other than your obedience to a manager. So it's like, what? This is a school teacher who said that? Yeah, he went down the rabbit hole in the history and the origins and the purposes of the school system. And when I asked him, I said, why did you spend so much time researching and digging into these documents? This is before the internet, mind you. This is digging into the stacks at the libraries. He said, I had to know for myself. I had to know that the system was created with these intentions. And he gives an out to these architects of the school system, and he says, don't think of it as evil. He says it is evil, but don't think of it as evil, meaning it's a logical, rational thing to do if you devalue other people's lives. If you believe in the Darwinian story that we evolved from nothing, and there's no value to the spirit, and there's no creator behind all this, there's no higher intelligence, if you prefer that term, and this is all an accident, then yeah, man is the ultimate arbiter. Versus, what if there is a creator? Like in the movie The Matrix, you brought up 1999. I'm thinking you were thinking The Matrix. That's a great, I think that's 99. But the architect of The Matrix, right? There was an architect, and that's what I'm beginning to believe, that this is created, and it's a beautiful experience in life, and we're here to learn things, and people are free to pursue what they want, except these guys, I think that's what they've concluded, is this is a fabricated life or a fabricated thing, and they want to dominate in perpetuity, as all monarchs would, to transfer the scepter of power to their children and grandchildren, and thinking that that's going to be a good thing, when money and power can destroy families and individuals. So the higher questions of education, I think, are, what are we after, and what do you desire? And I think literacy may be the one superpower that every parent would want their child to master and to fall in love with. And I teach this in some of my consulting, that your child already is an expert learner. They learn to walk and talk and do these things of their own drive and volition. You don't have to whip them into wanting to know the truth and find out the mysteries of the universe and mysteries of nature. This is exciting stuff. This is, maybe we'll have a show about Tesla, because I'm starting to get a little bit into Tesla, and he was way ahead of his time. And I think he said something to the effect that the present belongs to, these people, but the future belongs to me. So just a visionary man. And I think he was a autodidact entirely, as you mentioned, Malcolm X was. And as it relates to the literacy, I think Frederick Douglass too, his breakout moment was when the slave master saw his kindness, and then started teaching him language and teaching his words. And so this is all by design. We could even go to like the sight words, which is allegedly for the deaf, but they put that into books too, so you don't know the sounds, the sound code, the phonetics. The Phoenicians really did a favor, and maybe there's lots of history before the Phoenicians, but to sound out the different sounds, vowels, consonants, to crack the code of language, because when you can crack the language, you can create the language, and then you can actually create a movement and create allies and create future leaders. And that's what this is about. It's an intergenerational plan, and they have a unrighteous plan, and I'm speaking plan for intergenerational freedom, which is the transfer of the knowledge of the truth of self-ownership to the young people, because that was one of the big secrets that I saw from Aubrey Herbert in 1906. I think it's called Plea for Voluntarism, which is voluntary relationships. So these are the ideas that are very exciting. And yes, if somebody's talking about Hitler and the Germans and they try to play the left right, I invite the listeners here to transcend the two sides and look at all sides and make your own calculations, that everyone has an agenda, especially if they do, as you said, get paid to promote this, or they have a spiritual type mandate that they believe in. Well, it's up to us now to create our own direction for our own lives and visions. And I think that's what's very exciting about this. We can have this kind of conversation and pull up these articles, and Zero Hedge, and address some of these things, which are empowering and liberating, to discover that you can think for yourself and not have to simply regurgitate what someone else tells you is the truth.
Great, thank you for that, David. And so bringing things all full circle here, we have this article, and I'm aware of the time here, and you've been very generous with your time. I don't want to abuse that. Do you have a few minutes to touch on this one, or should we shelve this?
Yeah, we can address this. I think there's some good things in here, and we could even go a few minutes over if necessary. Just as this is such powerful stuff.
Okay, yeah, just holler when you got to run, and we'll make that happen. But yeah, so we have the hidden crisis in our classroom, why education without character is failing America, also from Zero Hedge. And that's, I'm reminded of that statement from the Bible. I think it's in Psalms. Foundations once destroyed, what can the just do? If it's not Psalms, it sounds like something in Proverbs, but nevertheless, the point stands. Foundations once destroyed, what can the just do? And that is really the yeoman's work for those of us who haven't been driven out of education, who haven't been disillusioned uh, to the point of leaving. And golly, I suppose you'd not give anyone a hard time for that, given the difficulty at hand. But we have a heck of a problem on our hands. And part of it, too, is the errors are now bred in the bone, to quote Auden's poem, 1939. September 1st, 1939, the error bred in the bone for you and me. And that problem is that this utilitarian idea of so-called education has so shot through the society that it's the mission accomplished. And so people think education means the credential. Utilitarianism has so penetrated the bourgeoisie, the middle class, that they have a very difficult time. Even the people who might critique education, they have a difficult time separating that from economical concerns. It doesn't matter that the economical concerns are 5 seconds away from being blown sky high with this AI and with all sorts of interesting financial things happening across the world right now. It doesn't matter, because this is our conditioning. This is our training. This is our brainwashing. For hundreds of years, nearly, certainly for 100 years, if not 150 years, for certain. And we have to get back to some of my earlier sentiments and to David's. We really do have to get back to brass tacks. What is education? And I would argue, and I'll cede the floor to David now, but I would argue that indeed education without character is not an education. There's endless data. We have endless data with these machines, with the libraries, with the radio, even, and so forth. We have huge amounts, more than anyone ever had in human history. But data without wisdom is not education. And so all of us constantly must be revisiting these principles and these very deep questions. It's really the only way that we're going to come out of this dark wood.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. We have the data now. Now it's about personal leadership and self-direction. And as Michael Jackson says, the man in the mirror. This is one of the big discoveries that I found. And it's not just me. He did it. Every, I would say, significant or influential person in history realizes you don't change the world, you change yourself. And as I change myself, I can now impact other people through my example. And there's that quote right there in that article. It says, education must regain the recognition that human beings possess a spiritual nature. And authentic education must engage the soul, not just the intellect. Where others see education primarily as a means to acquire power, status, and material success, we see it as a path to self transcendence, a movement beyond ego driven desires toward a higher purpose. And this is one of the great quotes from this article, because I think the soul is, and it doesn't have to be a religious type idea, but the idea that we are more than our body. And we can address this at future conversations, because talking with you, John, is so fun. And you're such a well-read guy and a moral, heartfelt man. There's an institute called the Monroe Institute. It's been around for 40 or 50 years at least. And they teach people how to have out-of-body experiences using sound vibration in their ear. It was founded by Bob Monroe, and he's got great interviews online. He's passed away now, but he was a successful entrepreneur, and he was having dreams at night, and he was hitting his head on something, and he didn't know what it was. And go look up his story; it's very interesting. His conclusion, and he taught other people to do it as well, is we are more than our body. That's basically what we'll say. They won't like dive into too spiritual stuff, esoteric, airy fairy things, which don't work to reach the masses. But these were engineers, very rational. I think even mathematicians. Tom Campbell is one of his students who is out there doing really good work, talking about these types of discoveries. And that's my conclusion too, is that I am a spirit or a soul, and the education that I got was almost wholly for my body. And now we're having thirsts for better conversations and better connections, at least to ask the questions. And some people in religious circles have their dogma, and I was dogmatic in my 20s, and I thought I found the only truth. And then I started to open my mind a little bit and realize, oh, maybe this is one way. This doesn't have to be the only way. And as I looked into like the Native Americans' spiritual beliefs, Joseph Campbell was a big influence too. That we are spiritual in nature, I feel, and if we're not teaching the children now, like this is our generation, but the children now in 2025 and moving forward, we are doing them a disservice because we have the research. The Monroe Institute alone has done so much to show that you can actually go out there. I haven't been out there yet. I'd like to make the trip out there. I think it's in your neck of the woods, at least on the East Coast, somewhere, and experience these types of different modalities or concepts that can't be explained in the book. This is something experiential. And then we can address that education instead of forcing, I should say, supporting or staying silent about forcing children into these schools. And yes, this is, I think, one of the most exciting times. And it's also, I think, kind of a cautionary time as well, because these institutions, their number one function is to remain in existence. That's why it's mandatory attendance and mandatory property taxes to fund these things. Whereas you and I, and many of the listeners, I'm certain, are out here working on consensual transactions, of voluntary interactions to earn our living. And this is the big distinction, because this is extra difficult when you actually have to do it versus all you have to do is show up at the office and the paycheck is there. And that's not the real world. That's the government status world. And I'm interested in the market and kind of these types of topics where people can pursue their own questions and interests. And your article subtitle was, I think, The End of Civilization. And maybe we can talk about that on another show as well, where like civilization, like what is that? If we see the last 100 years and democide or death by government, as Gandhi said, I think this is 1935, maybe 1938, Gandhi went to England. And of course, they look at him as some Asian, uneducated guy because of his appearance, and he's wearing his sheets. And they asked Gandhi, so how do you like civilization? And he says, I'll let you know when I find it. Because he knew the British Empire was doing dastardly things all around the world. And that is not civilization. But to be civilized, in my view, is to engage in peaceful relationships. No matter how good your idea is, you don't get to force it on people using coercion or threats or intimidation. And the real good ideas, and I would say like our ideas, John, like online learning, like self-directed learning, personal leadership, moral education that you choose, those are attractive enough. And We don't have to force people. So ultimately, I think these ideas will win, but there are these institutions which don't want to lose their paycheck. They don't want to lose their pension. They don't want to lose potentially the quote status that a quote professor or PhD, somebody teacher in these arcane coercive institutions might feel. And that's too bad for them because the children are more important than them or their, I should say, their financial security. We are the children, and the children are the most precious, vulnerable, dependent, sincere, pure humans that we have, and we were all a part of that in our childhood. And for us to prepare the future for the next generation, I think is of utmost importance and value. And I think that's one of the reasons I do what I do, and maybe yourself as well, John.
Thanks, David. I think that's a good place to put down the bird. So once again, this has been the November edition of This Month in Ed. And we've been looking at character education crises and the ways to solve it. Our articles for this month are linked below. We have The Hidden Crises in Our Classroom and Why Education Without Character is Failing America. We also have These Are the World's Most Educated Populations. And finally, The Dawn of the Post-Literate Society. We'll have that down below. And of course, David's link tree will be there, and he's available for consulting. And do you do tutorial work as well, David, for different subjects? Or how would you describe some of the things you can offer parents and students?
Yes, I do more custom programming. A lot of it's teenagers getting them out, and some of these questions of redefining the education. I do have some courses for homeschooling, and that's where I'm focusing now. But there's been so much. I wrote a book as well, and the it's there's so many opportunities that I'm seeing that the movie world, and we haven't talked about that, I don't think. Um, as people stop reading, the medium changes. So I got in business with this director, and we're in the midst of a movie now, a fictional narrative, because culture is the battleground, or at least one of them, that are very significant. And movies, TV shows are a key component of that. So I do consulting, and apprenticeship consulting is also something that I do to help parents. But the learning model, I should say, the education schooling model that I went through, and most of the parents, is inverted. And it's a really tough pill to swallow. So it's almost generational. So I don't try to force it. But the parents that know they need to change what they're doing, for their child's education, or at least, as Wayne Gretzky, the great hockey player, said, I don't look where the puck is, I look where the puck is going. And that's why I appreciate these conversations, because you and I are talking about where the puck of education is going, and it is going to be in these types of self-directed model areas. So yeah, I might offer some courses in the future, but right now I'm working on this film and the individual consulting, uh, early high school graduations, and I have, of course, the Facebook group Homeschool Leader, where there's over 20 curriculum that I've created in there for parents to go and look and explore some of the curriculum based on my worldview that might be empowering for the parents, that you can get for free. So that's how they can get some of the trainings, and of course the Linktree has a couple courses that they can invest into.
Great, thank you for that, David. And I did notice that there's also a place to assist you materially. You'll see a PayPal at the bottom of this, humbly there, but necessarily there. So I hope people will take advantage of that and help David out and thank him for his time materially. You may do that with his PayPal. And then when you are all set and you've stacked your plate high with this good stuff on David's link tree, then you can shimmy shammy over to Abuckus to Stacy's, and we have all sorts of good stuff, including our historical cycles course, The Sons of Issachar. The train is leaving the station, but you can still hop on and join us into the new year studying this topic of historiography and philosophy. All right, well, that'll do us for this month of November 2025. And get reading, everyone, and get learning and get truly educated. All right, David, thank you so much.